All right, here's this, it'll open up to the syllabus, but if you go to the module page or the module links, and you'll see these modules. I think you can minimize, I usually keep them minimized, but I think you can open them and minimize them and maximize them yourself. So just remember that there's like part 1, part 2, part 3, and then you got one for exams, and there's some Examity stuff, some information about signing up for Examity. If you've used Examity before, it's no big deal. If you have an account with them, then it should go pretty smoothly. But if you've never used Examity, you'll have to go in and like create an account, but it's not that big a deal. It's not too expensive. The bonus, I've got additional resources. I won't show you those yet. But in the, here are the various parts. Can you all see that? Is that big enough? Okay. For example, maximize just a little bit. Okay, so here's the first part, or the first 10 lessons. So these are lessons under here, introduction to the chords, etc. So let's see, I think I may have, let's see, some of these I haven't messed with yet. Okay, now I've got videos from previous courses and recordings of what I've said, like this is from last fall. I'll leave that stuff in there, but it's not required, okay? If you want to maybe hear more discussion about it, you're welcome to check those out. But within each lesson, and this is like the removal error we'll cover next week, you'll click on this link to get to the slides, and I'm making it prettier, but if you click on this link, then you'll see the PowerPoint that covers this stuff, and what I'll use next time. That's not really what I want to talk about, but so I'll close this. If you don't have the chapter, like here is, and I'll have to turn this on for you, but chapter 3 is in a PDF, and this is totally illegal. It's probably not too illegal. You're buying the book anyway, but what I've done here is I've created PDFs of just photocopies of my book, because I've run into the same issue before with people not being able to get the book early enough. So you can ignore my scribbles, but you might want to pay attention to the scribbles, because that's probably what the important stuff is. Now, so you can read that if you can read it. So that's there. That's not what I want to look for. Let's see here. Where did I do this? Termination. Yeah. Okay. So when we get to chapter 9 on the termination era, you'll see your PowerPoint slides, and then the things I wanted to point out here are your reading assignment in the textbook. Obviously, I need to edit that, but I'm going to give you links to a lot of the federal cases. With the termination era, it's a pretty short chapter. There is one case that's examined called the Menominee Tribe of Indians versus the United States, 1968. Just to show you what this, the resource that's there for you, it's pretty cool. This site is called Justia. If you could, please write that down, Justia, and go to that website after class, go to that website and create yourself a free account. They won't spam you. It's a law research. It's a free law research organization, and I'll show you what they have. So on this particular case, I've linked. I've provided the link. So if you open that, this is what you will see. You will get this: Menominee Tribe of Indians versus the United States, 1968. Okay, now this little number right here is the citation for that particular Supreme Court case. When you look at that number, it's quite apparent real quickly, and you will cover this in one of the exercises, but I'm just telling you now. When you see U.S., that's a United States Supreme Court case. All right. The circuit courts of appeals cases are a lot more convoluted in terms of their citation. What this means is the abbreviation U.S. refers to the United States record, and that is the record of of Supreme Court cases. Anyway, that's really not what I was going to show you, but you have a sort of a breakdown of the case. You can also go to Wikipedia and look these up, because Wikipedia is usually useful too. But there's another thing. If you go to audio and media, it will take you to another site called Oyez, but I've already linked that from the page. So the Oyez, and that's Oyes. You really know what that is? You've heard of Oyez? Okay. We'll keep that a mystery. If you open that link, it'll take you to the Oyez page for that same case. And this is cool. You can hear if you click on this, this was a long case too, by the way. You'll get this. Everybody see that? So this was a 1968 case. There aren't any women on the Supreme Court in 1968. There's one black man, African-American, and that's Thurgood Marshall. All right. Thurgood Marshall is a pretty interesting figure in history. But what I was wanting to show you was, this is an hour 39 minutes. I'm not going to ask you to listen to it, but say, for example, you're interested in the termination era, or you're interested in this particular case for your term paper, okay? You can actually listen to the proceedings.
Menominee Indians live in eastern Wisconsin.
Can y'all hear that?
May I ask if the state requires them to do all of those things?
I am
requiring them to pay a license fee.
Now this is speaking, that's the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, Earl Warren. This was during the period called the Warren Court. You'll read about that. And the discussion taking place is the oral argument between Charles A. Hobbs, I guess. Is that right? Yeah, Charles Hobbs, who's arguing one side of the case. And he's arguing it, and then the justices, in this case, Mr. Chief Justice Earl Warren, is going to be asking questions, and then you can hear the discussion. It's interesting.
I am not informed, Mr. Chief Justice, exactly to what extent, if any, the state waives its regulations. My understanding is it's general enforcement.
But they claim that right here, at least. Is that correct?
The state does claim the right to impose all of its rules, including license fees, on the Indians. These Indians have always hunted and fished for subsistence, and many of them still do today. In 1854, they made a treaty with the United States, giving up the last of their lands to the United States for the purpose of settling them up with the white settlers. In return, they received a reservation which, as we shall see, gave them the right to hunt and fish on that reservation according to their custom.
Just to give you a little taste of it. Now,
not because they're Indians, not because they're Menominee Indians, but because their parents own the stock. Does the plan inhibit the Indians from individual Indians from transferring outside of the tribe his ownership interest in the corporation?
Well, the statute says that interest shall be heritable only in accordance with such regulations as may be adopted for the tribe. Did they ever adopt it?
May I consult with counsel?
This is a really long case, and I don't need to waste any more of your time on that. But it's a fun sort of resource. And this one doesn't have it because it's a really convoluted case. But if you go to, let's say, most of the cases will have not just, this one has an oral re-argument. That's a really long thing. Most of these have an announcement of the opinion of the court. And the opinion of the court means there are nine justices. If the decision is split, it could be a 5-4 decision, right? Now, if it's a 5-4 decision, generally what you're going to have is what's called the concurring opinion, which is the opinion that won the vote, that is the 5. They will give their reasoning, their argument for their ruling. But there will also be dissenting opinions. Sometimes there are additional concurring opinions, but there are also dissenting opinions, and those are sometimes just as important. The dissenting opinions that lost sometimes have much better arguments, as you might see. So, but the opinion announcement is a formal reading of the sort of a quick summary of the overall. Well, it's the actual opinion that's been written. So sometimes they're just a minute long. Sometimes they're maybe 5 minutes long. But this is what OEA provides you. Okay. So jumping out of that, that's just what I wanted to demonstrate. And also, I will also have linked, in case, in fact, today I have linked an actual document. So we'll have a look at that. All right, so I'm going to go back to Canvas. You don't have any questions at this point? Okay, so we'll go to, like I said, the first chapter. I'm not even going to have you read much of it. Where am I looking? Module, okay. We'll go to the pre-USA Foundations chapter discusses, so what I want you to read is just read 27 through 30, 27, 28, 29, part of 30 for that chapter. You can read it all if you want, but the Spanish, he has something about the Spanish. I don't know why. It doesn't really fit. And he talks a little bit about the Native American governments prior to the United States. Of course, we all realize that they have their own systems and governments. We don't need to be persuaded that way. But what I do want you to talk about with this reading, what I want you to look for are, and this is not much of an outline, it's kind of a list of stuff. In that chapter, you will read about British Indian policy. You will read about boundaries. You'll read about the Royal Proclamation of 1763. I may post some slides about that also. But, and anyway, so here are the discussion questions. These are what you really want to look into before our next meeting, because these are going to be, is that right? No, we're not going to talk about those next time. We're talking about them now. So I'll just give you the skinny on them. These will more than likely be these are potential questions on the quiz, but let's see now. There are about 2 or 3 documents you'll read about. You'll read about a doctrine called the doctrine of discovery. Okay. And that's actually not something that was really early. It sounds like it was, but it wasn't. The Royal Proclamation of 1763 is not really discussed very well in this chapter, but has anybody ever heard of that? The Proclamation? 1763, if you're a history major, if you've had some history, what happened in 1763 in North America? It was the final year of a war.
French and Indian War?
Yeah, it was the final year of what we in North America call the French and Indian War. In Europe, it's called the 7 Years' War. And what happened was that was the war generally between France and England, but it also involved a lot of native people because the French and the English had strong ties, and the Dutch had strong ties to, well, the Dutch a lot earlier, 100 years earlier. So the English and the French had strong ties to native groups who had very powerful, militaries. And so anyway, it ended. The British won. The British basically took everything that France owned still. Luckily, the French handed over Louisiana to the Spanish, so the British wouldn't get it, but we bought it later. And so in 1763, the King of England, George III, right? I think it was George III. The King of England had declared that there were some policy changes that were going to happen in the American colonies. All right. Now you have to know that, the 13 colonies at this point were all, they were growing, but they were all very, very distinctive. They had their own economies, really had their own sort of ways of doing things, their own sort of local governments, representative government, had their own dialects. They were really different countries, different colonies, but they were beginning. Those colonies were growing enough that they were beginning to expand beyond the ability of the British government and the British military to protect the settlers. Okay, and this obviously was a big issue that led to the American Revolt, in the 1770s. But one of the parts of the Royal Proclamation was something called the Line, the Royal Proclamation Line, 1763, and basically that was a boundary it was essentially a perceived boundary as the drainage divide, the highest point, the crest of the Appalachian Mountains. And American colonists, wherever they may be, Virginia or North Carolina or Pennsylvania, they were told that they were if they crossed the crest of the Appalachian Mountains, then they were going to be in Indian country. And if they crossed that line, number one, they were forbidden to cross that line. Number two, if they did cross that line, then they were subject to a penalty of death by the British government. The King of England laid down a very strict law with the death penalty by creating a division between the American colonies and Indian country, just one from France. So why do you think they did that? They wanted to keep the peace, right? So the British government didn't want any more wars. And if there were going to be wars, it realized that there were going to be wars between American settlers expanding into land owned, claimed by the Indian tribes. So the Proclamation Line was a very specific attempt, very clear attempt by the British government to ease tensions between the American colonists and the native peoples, with the outcome of having peace and not having to protect American citizens. By the way, part of the proclamation was anyone who crossed that line into Indian territory, Indian country, would no longer be under the protection of the British government. So you were on your own if you did that, and if you were caught, then you were actually guilty of a crime with the penalty of death. Well, it wasn't enforceable, obviously, right? Nobody's going to enforce it. But the whole idea was to, try to maintain relationships between the Indians and the British government, and the colonists, of course, ignored it. Generally, some of them did. Now, that's my first point. Another point is that here's a question down here. Describe how the British Crown managed relations with the Indian tribes before United States independence. The British Crown is the sovereign. Okay, that's important. And who, by the way, the sovereign the sovereign of the United Kingdom just celebrated her 70th year on the throne, right? Or is it 75th? 75th year on the throne. It's 1947. So, I mean, I've spent a lot of time on the throne, but not that long. Okay. All right, just seeing if you're awake. The British queen or king is referred to as the sovereign. Okay, the individual is the sovereign. The crown, on the other hand, the crown refers to the British sovereign government, the British government, really. So if you go to Canada, sometimes you'll hear about crown lands, things like that. That refers to basically public lands or lands claimed by the British Crown, the British government. So the sovereign is there. So the British North America, as it was referred, British North America, the colonies of British North America, did not have the power to engage with Indian tribes. Sovereign Indian tribes did not, and the British Crown prohibited the colonists from making deals with Indian tribes. That was only the purview of the British Crown government. Okay, the Redcoats. Americans were not allowed to deal with. Now this is something that evolved. Okay, so the British had arrived in large numbers by the 1620s. Jamestown even earlier, right? The 1620s in Massachusetts and in other places by the middle part of the 1600s, policy had begun to sort of develop enough that the British government, the Crown, was having to come in and place protection over certain colonies by making them so-called royal colonies. So a lot of colonies started off as either individual entrepreneurial, essentially businesses, and some colonies were founded by individual proprietors, like Pennsylvania or Georgia. But the British government found that they were often failing, they were often having difficulty. So the Crown came in and placed its protection over that colony by making it a crown colony or a royal colony. Like Virginia was made a royal colony, Maryland made a royal colony. And that gave the colonists there some protection by the British government. The British government didn't want to do that for everybody. And in time, the policy became, okay, nobody messes with the Indian tribes except the king and the king's men and the king's representatives in the colonies, who were the governors. Okay, so in the king's representative, the crown's representative in the colonies were the governors and the governor's staff. Those people had some authority. They had the authority to interact with Indian tribes to perhaps make treaties. And yes, indeed, there were many treaties made between the British government acting through a particular colonial governor and Indian tribes. Okay, and those are important. You don't need to learn about them, but those early treaties began to recognize the sovereignty. They certainly recognized the sovereignty of the Indian tribes. The colonists didn't necessarily feel represented by the governor, and so that's where some friction began. But there are treaties that predate the United States, and some treaties that predate the United States are still in effect to some degree. Now, when the United States won its independence, the transfer of power basically transferred the sovereignty over the lands that the British Crown held. That sovereignty over that territory, all the way to the Mississippi River, was transferred to the United States federal government. Okay. Now, who's the sovereign in Britain right now? Who's the sovereign?
The Queen.
Yeah, Elizabeth II, the Queen Elizabeth II. She's an individual. Who is the sovereign in the United States?
We the people.
We, the people. So that's the big difference. We revolted maybe not your ancestors, but my ancestors revolted against the crown. They were not, too enthusiastic about celebrating king and queen's birthdays. They wanted to have representative democracy. And so the Constitution of the United States places that sovereignty with the people. You hear the people in many important documents. So that's a big difference. That means that rather than a king and the king's court and the king's highly educated staff making very well-educated, rational decisions, that now the decisions go to the representatives of the people. And who are those? The sovereign in the United States. We're the sovereigns. However, we're not the ones who make our laws. What do we do?
We elect our officials, our elected officials.
We have elected officials, and at the federal level, we have congressmen and we have senators and we have a president. And think about that for a little bit. We've taken the sovereign king, and that sovereign king was making the decisions, and now giving it to the representatives of the people. Okay. All right. So that's very important. In American Indian policy, the sovereign is with the people, but the Indian policy is not going to be made by the Congress, by the House of Representatives and the Senate. Okay. Not the president, not the king, but the Congress. And so a very basic fact, American Indian tribes are not protected by the Constitution, at least not initially. And the sovereign American Indian tribes are not subject to the Constitution. They're not protected by the Constitution. They are almost entirely wholly subject to the power of the United States Congress within the system, within the federal system. Okay. Now, fortunately, you and I are not under the thumb of the Congress. Okay. We have a judiciary, we have a Constitution protecting us, and perhaps even an executive that might do some good sometimes. All right, so just an important point there. So I think you can answer these now. What were the objectives of the diplomatic relations of the tribes? Did the British recognize tribal sovereignty? Yes, the British absolutely recognized tribal sovereignty. And they transferred that recognition of tribal sovereignty to the United States. Okay, so they transferred that sovereignty to the Congress. Did any of the British colonies sign treaties? Okay, that's it. Okay, let's move on.